The shadow in the attic. Sarah Lawrence had always dreamed of owning a home that felt like it belonged to another era, something with history, with stories buried in its walls. When she inherited her grandmother's old Victorian house, perched at the edge of a quiet New England town, she thought she'd stumbled upon a golden opportunity. The house was creaky and dust-ridden, but to Sarah, it was perfect. She'd restore it, give it new life, and make it her own. The attic was her first project. It had been sealed off for decades, its door warped shut by years of humidity and neglect. Sarah pried it open with a crowbar, a wave of stale air washing over her. Cobwebs hung in thick curtains, and the wooden floor groaned under her weight. In one corner, nearly hidden beneath a faded tarp, was a large trunk. Its iron latches were rusted, the keyhole caked with grime. Curiosity got the better of her. She found a screwdriver and worked at the latches until they gave way with a reluctant snap. Inside, she found an assortment of oddities, cracked porcelain dolls with glassy, unblinking eyes, yellowed letters tied with string, and a diary bound in brittle leather. The handwriting inside was spidery and uneven, the ink faded but legible. To whoever finds this, the first page read, "Be warned. The shadow watches." Sarah frowned. She flipped through the pages, most of which were filled with ramblings about something in the corners and warnings not to look away for too long. The entries became increasingly disjointed, the handwriting devolving into frantic scrawls. The last entry simply read, "It's here." She set the diary aside, unsettled but not entirely spooked. The artifacts seemed like the kind of eccentric keepsakes her grandmother might have collected. The diary? Probably an attempt at gothic fiction from a distant relative with too much imagination. She closed the trunk and continued cleaning. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, the house seemed louder than usual. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the walls felt amplified in the stillness. Around midnight, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps above her. Slow, deliberate, pacing in the attic. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. It's an old house, she told herself. With expanse, things settle. But the rhythmic tread of the footsteps didn't stop. Gathering her courage, she grabbed her phone and crept to the attic door. She flicked on the light and peered inside. Empty. The trunk sat where she'd left it, the attic's shadows stretching unnaturally long in the single bulb's weak glow. The silence was oppressive. She backed away and shut the door, locking it this time. The next morning, she discovered claw marks on the attic floorboards, gouged deep into the wood near the trunk. Sarah's breath hitched. They hadn't been there the day before. She spent the day convincing herself it was nothing. Maybe the marks had been there all along, hidden beneath the layers of dust. Maybe she'd overlooked them. But as night fell, unease settled over her like a heavy blanket. She drifted into a restless sleep, only to jolt awake hours later. Something was wrong. The air in her room felt heavier, colder. Slowly, she turned her head. In the corner, where shadows pooled darkest, a figure stood. Its form was vague, amorphous, like smoke trapped in the shape of a man. It didn't move, but Sarah felt its presence pressing against her, a malevolent weight. She squeezed her eyes shut, her chest tight with fear. When she opened them again, the figure was closer. Just a step or two forward. She could make out faint, glinting eyes, like pinpricks of light in the dark. Sarah's throat tightened as panic clawed at her insides. She turned her face into the pillow, heart racing. Minutes passed. Hours? She didn't know. When she finally dared to look again, the shadow had moved closer still. It loomed at the edge of her bed, its outline sharpening, its eyes glowing brighter. Sarah bolted upright and flicked on the lamp, bathing the room in yellow light. The shadow was gone. She stared at the empty corner, trembling. Her mind raced with possibilities, stress, sleep paralysis, a lingering dream. But then she noticed the claw marks on her bedroom floor, identical to those in the attic. They hadn't been there before. And when she turned to look at her reflection in the mirror across the room, she saw the shadow standing behind her, its glowing eyes locked on hers. Ava Morgan had been chasing stories for years, digging into places most people were smart enough to avoid. When word of the disappearances in Hollow Creek reached her, she booked a ticket the same day. Something about the isolated Appalachian town tugged at her curiosity, the kind of story that could make her career, or at least shake the rust off her reputation. The locals didn't welcome her with open arms. She expected that. People in towns like Hollow Creek didn't trust outsiders, especially not reporters with cameras and questions. But Ava had dealt with worse. She smiled, kept her voice calm, and asked them about the missing 3 teenagers, 2 hikers, and 1 drifter. The police had filed the cases under unsolved and moved on. The townspeople, however, had their own explanation. "It's the spirit in the woods," one man told her over a pint at the only bar in town. "You hear the whispers, you don't come back. Simple as that." "What kind of whispers?" Ava asked. "People you lost. People you're missing." His eyes darted toward the window, even though it was broad daylight. "It calls to you. Makes you forget yourself. Next thing you know, you're gone." She'd heard plenty of ghost stories in her time, but this one had teeth. There was something in the man's voice, not fear exactly, but the kind of reverence reserved for things people can't explain. Others in the bar avoided her gaze, as if speaking about it might invite trouble. "Do you believe it?" she asked. He just shrugged and took another sip of his beer. "Doesn't matter if I do." "You should." The woods were thick and dark, even in the early afternoon. Trees loomed like sentinels, their branches knitting together to blot out the sun. Ava had her camera slung around her neck, a flashlight in her pocket, and a notebook in hand. She wasn't here to scare easily. The first hour passed without incident. Birds chirped, the wind rustled leaves, and her boots crunched against the forest floor. But as the light began to fade, the air shifted. The birds fell silent, and the wind seemed to die. That was when she heard it. Ava. Her name, carried on the breeze, soft and familiar. She stopped in her tracks, her heart thudding in her chest. "Who's there?" she called, spinning in a slow circle. The forest swallowed her voice. "Ava." This time it was stronger, closer. And the voice, it sounded like her mother. Ava clenched her fists, shaking her head. Her mother had been gone for 5 years. She knew this, knew it with every rational part of her brain. But the voice was unmistakable. It was her mother calling to her, just as she had on lazy Sunday mornings when Ava was a child. She followed the sound. She didn't want to, but her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her deeper into the woods. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees like threads of smoke. Her mother's voice mixed with others now, a cacophony of lost loved ones and desperate cries. They pulled at her, each step sinking her further into a fog of memory and longing. Eventually, she reached a clearing. At its center stood an ancient tree, its trunk gnarled and blackened, its roots spreading out like claws. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, funneling toward the tree. Ava's breath hitched as she stepped closer, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. She noticed the carvings first, names etched into the bark, hundreds of them. Some were fresh, their cuts raw and oozing sap. Others were faded, barely visible beneath the weathered surface. Her mother's name was there. Ava's hand trembled as she reached out to touch it, her fingers grazing the jagged letters. "Ava," the voice whispered again, closer than ever. She turned, but the clearing was empty. The shadows of the trees stretched long and thin, curling toward her like fingers. Her skin prickled with the sense that she wasn't alone. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, swirling around her like a storm. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. Her flashlight rolled away, its beam slicing through the darkness. That was when she saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, twisted and half-formed, pressed against the tree's bark as if trying to break free. Their mouths moved, their eyes pleading, but no sound came from them. The whispers were in her head now, relentless and deafening. Ava scrambled back, her hand brushing against something cold and metallic. A knife. It looked ancient, its blade tarnished but sharp. At its base was a small plaque, inscribed with the words, "The curse must feed." Realization struck like a thunderclap. The tree demanded sacrifices, and the town kept it secret. The missing weren't victims of some accident or chance. They were offerings. The whispers quieted, replaced by a single, clear voice, "Choose." Tears streamed down Ava's face as she looked from the knife to the tree, the faces staring back at her. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her, demanding her compliance. In her mind, she saw the bar, the townsfolk looking away, their silence complicit. "I'm sorry," she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to herself, the victims, or the shadowy spirit behind it all. When she emerged from the woods hours later, she was alone. The townspeople watched her return from their porches and windows, their expressions grim and knowing. No one asked her what she'd found, and she didn't offer to tell. But the woods were quieter that night, the whispers stilled. For now. The room that shouldn't exist. Jake Marshall had been living alone for a while, bouncing from one apartment to another, chasing a job and a life that never seemed to quite settle. So when he found a cozy unit in a quiet part of town at a price he could actually afford, he jumped on it. The place wasn't anything fancy, a single-bedroom apartment with a decent view and thin walls, but it felt like a step forward. It felt like his. The blueprints came with the lease agreement, part of the building's meticulous records. Jake glanced at them one evening while unpacking, his eyes skimming over the layout. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. But something caught his attention. There was an extra room, clearly marked in bold lines, connected to the living room. He frowned, standing in the middle of his space and turning in a slow circle. No such room existed. The blueprint showed a door where his blank living room wall now stood. Weird, he thought, but not impossible. Renovations happen, walls get put up, and blueprints don't always get updated. Still, the thought nagged at him. The first few nights were fine. Quiet, even. But on the fourth night, Jake woke up to a faint scratching noise. It was so subtle that at first he thought he'd imagined it. But there it was again, a soft, irregular scrape coming from the living room wall. The wall where, according to the blueprints, a door should have been. Probably mice, he muttered to himself, flipping over in bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The scratching came back the next night. And the next. Always faint, always from that same spot. By the fifth night, Jake decided to investigate. He pressed his ear to the wall, listening intently. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, so quietly he almost didn't catch it, he heard a soft creak, like the groan of an old hinge. The next morning, Jake resolved to forget about it. He wasn't a superstitious guy, and he had work to do. But that night, when he stepped into his living room, he froze. A door had appeared. It was flush with the wall, painted the same dull beige as the rest of the apartment, but it was undeniably there. The brass knob gleamed faintly in the dim light. "Nope," Jake said aloud, taking a step back. He wasn't about to start messing with something like this. But as the night wore on, curiosity gnawed at him. By midnight, he couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy wrench, Jake turned the knob and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, just like he'd heard before. The room beyond was dimly lit, as if some unseen light source barely illuminated its corners. It was small, barely larger than a walk-in closet. In the center sat an old rocking chair, its wood dark and polished with age. A mirror hung on the far wall, its surface slightly tarnished. That was it. No windows, no other furniture. Just a chair and a mirror. Jake stepped inside, the air feeling heavier as he crossed the threshold. He aimed his flashlight at the mirror, squinting at his own reflection. Everything looked normal at first. He raised his hand, his reflection raised its hand. He tilted his head, the reflection tilted its head. But then Jake froze. His reflection wasn't looking at him anymore. It was staring past his shoulder, its eyes wide with fear. A cold knot twisted in Jake's stomach. Slowly, he turned his head to look behind him. There was nothing there. Just the room, empty and silent. He whipped his head back to the mirror. His reflection had moved. It was still staring behind him, its mouth slightly open as if trying to scream. Jake stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering as it slipped from his grip. The beam danced across the room, catching the rocking chair as it swayed gently back and forth. He bolted. The door slammed shut behind him as he ran to his bedroom, locking the door and pushing a dresser in front of it for good measure. He spent the rest of the night sitting on his bed, every light in the apartment blazing. The scratching didn't come back that night. The next morning, Jake checked the living room wall. The door was gone. Just a blank stretch of beige paint, as if it had never been there. He spent the day convincing himself it was stress, an overactive imagination, maybe even sleepwalking. But that night, as he lay in bed, he swore he heard the faint creak of a rocking chair coming from the living room. And when he dared to peek out, he saw a faint outline of a door shimmering in the wall, waiting for him to open it again. Carnival of Lost Souls. "Who's running it?" asked Kara, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The air felt colder here, heavier. "No one's been here for years," Ellie said, pointing to the faded sign at the entrance. "Carnival of Wonders," it read in chipped gold letters. Below that, another sign dangled crookedly, its paint weathered away. She could just make out the words, "Closed indefinitely." But the place wasn't dead. Lights blazed along the midway, music spilled out from somewhere unseen, and the smell of popcorn and spun sugar drifted through the air. It was as if the carnival were waiting for them. "We should go back," Ellie said, her stomach twisting with unease. But no one listened. "Come on, Ellie. It's just a bunch of old rides," Matt said with a grin. "Let's check it out. Who knows when we'll find something like this again." Before she could protest, he and the others were already stepping through the rusted gates. The music grew louder as they walked deeper into the carnival, the distorted tune of a calliope echoing through the empty grounds. Ellie followed reluctantly, every instinct screaming at her to turn around. The first ride they came to was a carousel. The horses were carved from wood, their painted eyes wide and wild. As the group approached, the ride creaked to life. The music sped up, the lights flashed, and the horses began to move, their heads jerking unnaturally. "No way," Kara whispered, her voice a mix of awe and fear. Matt climbed onto one of the horses, laughing as it bucked beneath him. "See? It's fine," he called out, gripping the pole for balance. The others hesitated, but when nothing happened, they joined him. Ellie stayed on the ground, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The carousel spun faster and faster, the music warping into something shrill and discordant. Ellie called out for them to stop, but her voice was drowned out. Then, with a shudder, the ride screeched to a halt. The horses were empty. Matt, Kara, and the others were gone. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, searching the carnival grounds, but there was no sign of them. The midway was deserted, the lights casting long, flickering shadows. "Matt," she called, her voice cracking. "Kara? This isn't funny." "They're part of the show now," a voice drawled from behind her. Ellie turned sharply to see a tall figure in a tattered ringmaster's coat. His face was pale, his eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. He twirled a cane in one gloved hand, his smile sharp and predatory. "Who are you?" Ellie demanded, taking a step back. "The curator of this fine establishment," he said, spreading his arms theatrically. "And you, my dear, are our newest guest." Ellie's pulse thundered in her ears. "Where are my friends?" "Riding the attractions," he said, his grin widening. "The carnival hungers for souls, you see. It's how we keep the lights on." "You're lying," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "Oh, I never lie." The ringmaster gestured toward the Ferris wheel, where a new set of carriages was rising into view. Ellie's heart sank. Inside each carriage was a figure, still, pale, and lifeless. She recognized Matt's face pressed against the glass, his eyes wide in silent terror. "Let them go!" Ellie screamed, her fists clenched. "Oh, but the carnival doesn't release its performers," the ringmaster said, his tone mockingly sad. "Not unless." He leaned closer, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. "You're willing to take their place." Ellie's mind raced, panic threatening to swallow her whole. She glanced at the carousel, the Ferris wheel, the funhouse looming in the distance. The carnival seemed alive, feeding off her fear. "What happens if I don't?" she whispered. The ringmaster chuckled, his teeth gleaming. "Then you'll leave. Alone. And this place will wait for the next unlucky souls to wander in." Ellie looked at the Ferris wheel again, at Matt's frozen face. Her chest tightened. She couldn't abandon them. She wouldn't. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Take me." The ringmaster's smile widened. He snapped his fingers, and the lights around the carnival flared brightly. The air grew heavy, the shadows deepened, and the ground seemed to shift beneath Ellie's feet. "Welcome to the Carnival of Lost Souls," he said, his voice echoing as the world around her dissolved into darkness. When the lights faded, Ellie was gone. The Ferris wheel creaked to a stop, its carriages empty once more. The midway grew silent, the music fading into a haunting hum. And the carnival waited, its lights flickering, for the next visitors to arrive. The screaming portrait. Lila had always been a sucker for strange things. The kind of things that felt a little off, like an old music box with a broken tune or a cracked mirror that almost seemed to reflect a different world. So when she stumbled across the estate sale, the dusty attic piled high with forgotten treasures, she was drawn in immediately. There, leaning against a stack of old furniture, was the portrait. A massive frame, dark and ornate, with carvings that seemed to shift if you looked at them for too long. The painting itself was of a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide, as though caught in some deep, eternal sorrow. She wore a black veil that covered most of her face, except for her lips, which seemed almost frozen in a half-whisper of a scream. Lila couldn't explain why, but she had to have it. Maybe it was the sadness in the woman's eyes, or maybe it was the way the frame seemed to call to her. Either way, when she asked about it, the old man selling the estate gave her a warning that almost made her laugh. "It's cursed," he said, his voice hoarse as if he'd swallowed too much whiskey in his lifetime. "No one who's ever owned it has come to any good end. There's something wrong about that woman." Lila shrugged it off. "Cursed paintings? That was just a way to make something more interesting, a tactic to sell off the junk." She handed him the money, and before the man could say another word, the portrait was in her hands, and she was on her way home. The painting looked out of place in her tiny apartment, but she made room for it, hanging it above the fireplace, where it loomed over her like an old ghost. The first few nights were quiet. But after that, well, things began to change. It started with the screams. At first, they were faint, like whispers on the wind. But each night, they grew louder, until Lila was sure they were coming from the painting itself. The sound was sharp, raw, like a woman trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. It rattled her, but she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, the kind of thing that happened when you lived alone too long. But then came the eyes. The first time Lila noticed it, she was standing in front of the painting, brushing dust off the frame. When she looked up, she swore the woman's eyes had moved. They were no longer staring into the distance, lost in her mourning. Now, they were following Lila, every step, every turn, as though the woman in the painting knew exactly where she was going, what she was doing. It was unsettling, to say the least. But the worst part was the feeling that came with those eyes, the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something was waiting just beyond her reach, watching her every move, begging her for something. One night, unable to take it anymore, Lila stood in front of the portrait and stared back. The woman's face was as still as ever, but her eyes, those eyes, kept pleading. It was like a silent scream that vibrated deep in Lila's bones. She shuddered, her heart racing, as the air in the room grew heavy with some unseen weight. "Help me," Lila whispered, her voice shaking. In that moment, she saw it, the faintest flicker of movement in the woman's lips, the smallest quiver as if the painting itself was trying to speak. The scream from the painting grew louder, desperate, raw. Lila stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. She had to do something. Anything. But as she reached for the phone, to call someone, anyone, for help, the room seemed to darken. The air turned cold, and Lila heard the woman's voice, clearer than ever, whispering directly in her ear. "Help me, or you'll be next." Lila froze, her heart pounding in her chest as the portrait's eyes locked onto hers. She knew, deep down, that whatever was trapped in that painting had already begun to claim her, pulling her into a world of sorrow and screams she might never escape. The forgotten bunker. It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a camping trip in the woods with a few friends. The kind of thing they'd done every summer for years. But something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the dark clouds rolling in on the horizon or the strange chill in the air that hadn't been there the last time. Or maybe it was just that they were growing up and the world was starting to feel a little less safe. Ryan, Jesse, Noah, and Ella had set up camp near an old trail, the kind that led nowhere in particular, but seemed perfect for their adventure. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, laughing and telling stories, the flickering flames casting shadows on their faces. Then Noah, always the one to wander off, noticed something odd. Just off the trail, a patch of ground seemed out of place. The earth was disturbed, like something had been buried or hidden. Curious, he tugged at the overgrown weeds and pushed aside some rocks, revealing a rusty metal door, half buried in the dirt. "Hey, check this out!" Noah called, his voice full of excitement. The others crowded around, their interest piqued. Jessie, the skeptic of the group, was the first to voice her doubts. Could be a storm cellar or something. Nothing to get excited about. But Ryan was already pulling at the latch, which creaked and groaned under his hands. The door opened with a reluctant squeal, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into darkness. "Whatever it is, it's got to be interesting," Ryan said, grinning. "Let's check it out." Against their better judgment, the group decided to descend. The air down there was thick with dust and damp, the smell of something long forgotten. They stumbled through the dark, their flashlights cutting through the blackness, revealing walls covered in old, peeling paint. The deeper they went, the stranger it felt. It wasn't just a storm cellar or a forgotten basement. It felt like a place that hadn't been touched in decades, maybe longer. Then they saw it. Carved into the walls were strange, cryptic messages. The handwriting was jagged, as though someone had written in a hurry, desperate to get something down before time ran out. "Don't go deeper. The creature is still here. It feeds on the light. It watches." The hairs on the back of Ryan's neck stood up. He looked at the others, but no one said anything. They kept walking, their steps echoing off the concrete walls, deeper and deeper into the bunker. They passed rooms filled with old crates and rusted machinery, but nothing seemed to explain why the bunker was abandoned or what had been hidden there. It wasn't until they reached the center of the bunker that things really began to feel off. The power flickered, and the overhead lights buzzed, casting the whole place in an eerie, intermittent glow. And that's when they heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the darkness. For a moment, no one moved. The growl echoed off the walls, distant but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Ella whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the power went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Jessie fumbled for her flashlight, and when the beam finally flickered on, they saw something that made their blood run cold. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dark, was a shape. Something moving. Too large to be human. Too fast. "Run!" Ryan shouted, and they all bolted, their feet slamming against the cold concrete floor. The growl grew louder, closer, like it was right behind them, breathing down their necks. They sprinted back toward the stairs, the sound of something heavy chasing them, its steps too slow but relentless. They reached the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, or maybe something was blocking it on the other side. Panic set in as they hammered on the door, trying to force it open. The growl was closer now, closer than it had ever been. The creature was right there, just beyond the door, and they knew that if they didn't get out soon, they wouldn't make it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door flew open. They stumbled out into the night, gasping for breath, the cold air hitting their lungs like a shock. But when they turned to look back at the bunker, they saw nothing. No door. No stairs. Just the dark woods and the faint, lingering growl echoing through the trees. They ran. And as they made their way back to the camp, none of them spoke. None of them wanted to. Because they knew, deep down, that whatever had been locked away in that bunker wasn't done with them. It was still out there, waiting. The lighthouse of eternal night. Henry had never been afraid of the ocean. Sure, it was vast and unpredictable, but he had always admired its beauty from a distance. That's why when he was offered the job as the new keeper of a remote coastal lighthouse, he jumped at the chance. It seemed like the perfect escape, a quiet life away from the city, the constant noise, and the mess of his broken past. The lighthouse stood alone on a jagged cliff, its light flashing every few seconds, cutting through the thick fog that seemed to always hover over the sea. The view from the top was breathtaking, but it was also isolating. The nearest town was miles away, a small, foggy village that Henry only visited for supplies. At first, the job was exactly what Henry had imagined. He spent his days cleaning, maintaining the light, and getting used to the rhythm of the sea. But soon, things started to change. It began with the dreams. Every night, Henry dreamed of sailors, young men, their faces distorted by terror as they clung to pieces of broken ships, struggling against the waves. He could hear their screams, muffled by the roar of the ocean, feel their desperation as they drowned in the cold, dark water. He woke each morning drenched in sweat, heart pounding in his chest, convinced that it was just the isolation playing tricks on him. But the dreams only grew worse. Then came the night of the storm. The sky darkened early, and the wind howled against the lighthouse like it was trying to tear it apart. Henry had seen storms before, but this one felt different. The waves crashed against the rocks below, taller and angrier than he had ever witnessed. The light in the tower flickered, struggling to pierce the darkness, and Henry found himself staring out into the black void of the ocean, watching as the storm tore the sea apart. That's when he heard it, the sound of something crashing against the rocks below. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was the unmistakable sound of a shipwreck. Henry rushed down the spiral staircase, his heart racing. He stumbled through the door, running to the edge of the cliff to see if he could help. Below, the wreckage of a ship was being ripped apart by the relentless waves. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't see any survivors, just the remnants of the ship being pulled under by the angry sea. But then he heard the voices. They were faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but they grew louder as he listened. The voices of the drowned sailors, whispering his name. "Help us!" Henry's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, but there was no one there. The night was silent except for the wind and the crashing waves. The next few hours felt like a blur. He tried to keep the light steady, guiding what ships might be out there, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching him. That night, as he lay in his bed, the dreams returned. This time, they were more vivid, more real. The sailors' faces were so close, their eyes wide with terror, pleading for help. But as Henry reached out to help them, their hands slipped through his fingers, their bodies twisting and writhing in the depths of the water. Suddenly, he woke, gasping for air. But it wasn't the usual dream-induced panic. There was something in the room with him. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, flickering in the dim light from the lighthouse. He turned his head, and there, standing in the doorway, were the ghostly figures of the sailors. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The cold in the room was unbearable, and the air was thick with the smell of salt water. "Help us," they whispered, their voices hoarse, drowned by years of silence. Henry backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. I can't save you." The figures stepped closer, their forms flickering like they were trapped between this world and the next. "You must. The light. It guides us, but we are not meant to be saved." Henry's mind raced as he stumbled back. He had heard rumors about the lighthouse, whispers of its cursed history. Built over an ancient shipwreck, the lighthouse was said to be a guide for souls lost at sea, not to help ships, but to lead the dead to the afterlife. Each night, the spirits grew more desperate, their pleas more frantic. They crowded the lighthouse, their forms becoming more solid, more real. They clawed at Henry's door, dragged themselves across the floor, their whispers turning into screams. "Help us!" Henry couldn't take it anymore. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred. The ghosts were real, and they were growing stronger. Each night, they came closer, their cold, wet hands reaching for him, their hollow eyes burning into his soul. One night, as the storm howled outside, Henry knew it was too late. The lighthouse, with its bright, guiding light, wasn't there to save him, it was there to keep him trapped with them. He had become one of the sailors, one of the lost souls, doomed to wander the dark sea for eternity. As the first of the ghostly figures reached him, Henry heard the familiar whisper again, "Help us." And for the first time, he understood. He wasn't meant to guide ships to safety. He was meant to guide the dead to their final resting place. The dollmaker's curse. When Lily's grandmother passed away, it was like losing a part of herself. She had always been close to the old woman, who had lived in a creaky house at the edge of town, surrounded by strange trinkets and old stories. But what Lily hadn't expected to inherit were the dolls. Her grandmother had spent decades making them, delicate, handcrafted dolls, each one unique. Some were elegant, dressed in lace and velvet, their porcelain faces serene and perfect. Others were more rustic, with wooden limbs and stitched-up faces, but all of them had something unsettling about them. Lily had never liked them. They were always in the background of her grandmother's house, sitting on shelves, tucked into corners, watching her. Lily found them packed into boxes when she cleaned out her grandmother's house. She didn't know what to do with them. They were a legacy, but they were also a reminder of something that felt off, like her grandmother's love for them was obsessive, or maybe even a little dark. Still, she brought them home. They were hers now, after all. The first night, she placed the dolls on a shelf in her living room, trying not to look at them too much. But by the time the sun had set, Lily felt something shift in the air. It was subtle at first, like a cold breeze brushing against her neck. But when she glanced at the dolls, something was different. One of them, a small porcelain girl with a red dress, was facing the wrong way. It had been facing forward before, but now it was turned to the side, its blank eyes staring at her. Lily shook it off. It was just her mind playing tricks on her. Maybe the shelf had shifted, or maybe she hadn't placed it properly. But the next night, it happened again. The dolls were shifting, moving from one place to another, always in small, almost unnoticeable ways. A doll on the shelf would be facing a different direction, or a new one would appear to have shifted closer to the edge. She tried to tell herself it was the house settling, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. One evening, after a long day at work, Lily went to bed, her mind buzzing with exhaustion. She pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to forget the unsettling feeling that had been growing inside her for weeks. The dolls were in the living room, far from her, she thought. She could almost forget they were there. But in the middle of the night, something woke her. A coldness seeped into her room, and she blinked awake, groggy and confused. The room was darker than usual, and there, at the foot of her bed, stood the dolls. All of them. They were arranged in a circle, facing her. Their porcelain faces gleamed in the faint light of the moon coming through the window, their blank eyes staring at her, unblinking. Lily's heart skipped a beat. How had they moved? She was sure she'd left them in the living room, far from her room, far from the bed. But then her gaze fell on the last doll. the one her grandmother had been working on before she passed. It wasn't finished. The head was only partially formed, the face still a rough sketch of clay. But tonight, it was sitting at the foot of her bed, its head turned slightly toward her. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The head of the unfinished doll moved, just a little. It was almost imperceptible at first, like a slight shift, a barely their turn, but it was enough. The unfinished doll's face tilted toward her, the cracked, unformed eyes suddenly seeming to focus on her, empty yet full of something she couldn't name. The room felt like it was closing in. The air was thick, heavy, as if the dolls had come alive, their eyes filled with purpose. Lily could hear her heart pounding in her chest, the silence in the room oppressive. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The dolls sat there, watching, waiting. Their eyes followed her, and she realized, slowly, that she wasn't in control anymore. The unfinished doll's head tilted even further, its gaze locking onto hers as though it was waiting for something, waiting for her to do something. But Lily couldn't move. She couldn't escape. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the unfinished doll, its unblinking eyes staring into her soul, as if it had always known that this moment would come.